Please support this channel by subscribing. Your support means everything to us and helps us keep creating stories like this. She was invisible to the palace, mocked by nobles, ignored by guards, and counted as nothing more than dust beneath their feet. No one knew that before the night ended, the vampire king himself would be forced to look at her, and everything would begin to crack. The palace of Noctir Vale breathed power and cruelty in equal measure. Its black marble halls lit by crimson fire and lined with portraits of kings who had ruled through fear for centuries. And among the whispers of silk gowns and the echo of jeweled laughter moved a single maid named Ilara. Her steps careful, her eyes lowered, her hands aching from hours of work that no one ever thanked her for. Because in a palace ruled by immortals, humans were temporary things, easily replaced, easily broken. Ilara had learned early that survival meant silence. That dignity was something you carried inside, even when the world stripped everything else away. And so she endured the sharp words of noble women who mocked her accent, the careless shoves from guards who treated her like furniture, and the quiet cruelty of being seen but never acknowledged, all while carrying trays of silver goblets through halls where her life was worth less than spilled wine. That night was the winter convergence, the grand feast where vampire lords gathered to celebrate victories won in blood and shadow, and the air was heavy with power as Ilara entered the great hall, her arms trembling slightly under the weight of a tray filled with crystal glasses, her heart beating faster, not from excitement, but from fear, because the vampire king himself had returned from war, and when he was present, mistakes were not forgiven. The king of Noctir Vale, known as Caelan Viremont, sat upon his obsidian throne at the far end of the hall, his presence so overwhelming that even the oldest nobles kept their voices low, his crimson eyes unreadable, his expression carved from centuries of discipline and loss. And Ilara dared not look at him, because looking meant being noticed. And being noticed had never ended well for her. As she moved between the tables, laughter erupted at her expense when a noble deliberately extended a foot into her path, causing her to stumble just enough for one goblet to tip, the glass slipping from her tray and shattering against the marble floor, the sound cutting through the hall like a blade. And for one suspended heartbeat, the music stopped, every gaze snapping toward her as red wine spread across the white stone like blood. Ilara froze, her breath trapped in her chest, humiliation burning hotter than fear as mocking laughter burst from the nobles, voices sharp and delighted, calling her clumsy, calling her worthless, calling for punishment as if her shame were entertainment meant to spice their feast. The duchess closest to the throne rose slowly, her lips curled in disgust as she pointed at Ilara with a jeweled finger and demanded she be dragged out and beaten for ruining the evening. And the guard stepped forward without hesitation, gripping Ilara's arms as she tried to apologize, her words dissolving into the noise, her feet barely touching the floor as she was pulled toward the exit, her heart pounding not with hope, with the familiar realization that no one would stop this, because no one ever did. The hall had already begun to move on, laughter rising again, the orchestra resuming as if her humiliation were nothing more than a brief interruption. Then the temperature dropped. It was subtle at first, a sharp stillness that crept through the room, extinguishing laughter mid-breath, and the guards faltered as a single sound echoed from the throne. Not loud, not violent, but absolute, the slow scrape of stone as the vampire king stood. Caelan Viremont did not shout, did not rage. He simply looked toward the center of the hall, his gaze landing not on the nobles, not on the duchess, but on Ilara, still trapped in the guard's grasp, her head bowed, unaware that for the first time in her life, the most powerful being in the kingdom was truly seeing her. "Release her," the king said, his voice calm, controlled, and deadly in its restraint. The guards froze, the nobles stared in disbelief, and Alara lifted her eyes just enough to meet his gaze for a fraction of a second, not knowing why her chest tightened, not knowing that in that moment, something ancient and dangerous had awakened inside the king, something that would soon force him to choose between his crown and the girl everyone else had deemed disposable. She did not yet know it. But the moment the vampire king stood for her, her life as a maid was already over, and the cost of that moment would shake the kingdom. The hall believed the moment would pass, that the king's words were a pause, not a turning point. They were wrong, because once a vampire king notices a maid, the world never returns to its shape. Silence crushed the grand hall as Kalen Viremont stood, his full height unfolding like a shadow pulled free from the wall. And in that stillness, every noble felt the ancient fear they pretended not to carry, because the king's power was not loud or theatrical. It was patient, lethal, and absolute, and when his crimson gaze remained fixed on Alara, it was as if the rest of the room ceased to exist. The Duchess's jeweled hand still raised mid-accusation, the guards' fingers loosening without conscious thought, their instincts screaming that holding on to the girl was suddenly dangerous. Alara felt the grip on her arms fade, confusion flooding her as she staggered forward, her pulse roaring in her ears, unable to understand why she had not been thrown into the cold, why the punishment she had already accepted had simply stopped. Kalen descended from the throne with unhurried steps, each one echoing through the marble floor, the sound alone enough to make several nobles lower their eyes. And when he stopped before Alara, the air between them tightened, heavy with something she could not name, her fear warring with an unfamiliar sensation that felt dangerously close to safety. "Who ordered this?" Kalen asked, his voice quiet, but carrying across the hall like a blade dragged slowly from its sheath. And though the Duchess opened her mouth to speak, no sound came at first, because centuries of privilege did not prepare one for being questioned by a king who rarely bothered to explain himself. When she finally stammered that the maid had ruined the feast, that discipline was necessary. Kalen's gaze did not leave Alara, not even for a heartbeat, and that omission unsettled the court more than anger ever could. "A spilled glass is not a crime," he said calmly, "but cruelty disguised as tradition is." And the nobles shifted uneasily as the words settled, realizing this was not a performance, this was judgment. Alara felt exposed beneath his attention, painfully aware of her torn gloves, her bowed posture, the way she had trained herself to take up as little space as possible. And yet Kalen saw more than the surface, something in the way she stood despite the humiliation, the way she did not beg, did not scream, did not curse the world that had treated her so lightly. And it stirred a memory he had buried long ago, of a time before crowns and blood oaths, before immortality stripped people of consequence. "Leave us," Kalen ordered the guards, and they obeyed instantly, retreating without question, while the Duchess, flushed with outrage and fear, forced to step back as well, her power evaporating under the weight of his indifference. The hall waited for punishment, for blood, for spectacle, but Kalen offered none of it, instead turning to Alara and asking her name, a simple question that struck her harder than any slap, because no noble had ever asked her that before. "Alara," she whispered, her voice trembling despite her effort to remain composed, and something in the way she said it, not defiant but unbroken, tightened Kalen's jaw. He nodded once, as if sealing something unseen, then addressed the court without raising his voice, declaring that the feast would continue, that no further discipline would be inflicted, and that Alara would return to her duties under his protection, a phrase that sent a ripple of disbelief through the nobles, because protection from the vampire king was not something granted lightly, especially not to a human maid. As the music resumed in uncertain tones and conversation cautiously returned, Alara was escorted not to the servants' corridor, but to the edge of the hall, her mind spinning, her body tense, knowing too well that attention from a king could be as dangerous as cruelty from nobles. And when Kaelin finally turned away from the court and spoke softly, meant only for her, his words chilled and steadied her all at once. "You should not have been treated that way," he said, not as a ruler, but as someone stating a truth long ignored, and before she could respond, he added, "This is not mercy. It is notice." Alara did not yet understand what that meant, but as she watched the vampire king return to his throne, aware of the hostile eyes now following her every move, she felt a deeper fear take root, because in a palace built on power, being noticed was never free. And somewhere beneath the marble and blood, fate had begun to rearrange itself around her, preparing a choice neither of them was ready to face. Alara survived the night, but she did not realize the real danger would begin the moment the vampire king decided she mattered. Asterisk. By dawn, the palace had already decided she was a problem. By nightfall, they would try to erase her. Alara felt it the moment she stepped back into the servants' wing. The air sharper, the whispers no longer careless but intentional, eyes following her with a new kind of hostility that curled in her stomach. Because yesterday she had been invisible, and today invisibility had been replaced by something far more dangerous: attention. No one spoke to her directly, yet every movement she made seemed to ripple outward, rumors growing with each step, the story changing from a spilled goblet to dangerous favoritism, to darker suggestions that made her cheeks burn with shame she had not earned. She scrubbed floors, folded linens, and kept her head down, but fear crept into her bones. Because she understood one truth: the nobles did not bother hiding maids. Who drew notice did not last long. Kaelin observed all of it from a distance, his presence heavy in the palace even when unseen. And though he spoke to no one about the girl, he noticed how servants flinched when her name was whispered, how guards lingered longer near her stations, not to protect but to watch. And it unsettled him in a way no political threat ever had. He told himself it was irritation at disorder, and nobles who mistook cruelty for law. Yet every time his gaze found Alara moving quietly through the halls, something twisted inside him. Because she carried herself the same way she had the night before, small, steady, refusing to shrink further, even when the world demanded it. The first test came without ceremony. In the lower kitchens, a younger servant slipped on wet stone and fell hard, a tray of knives skittering across the floor. And before anyone else reacted, Alara dropped beside her, hands shaking but voice calm, pulling the girl away from the blades, while others stood frozen, calculating risk. Blood seeped from a shallow cut, and Alara tore fabric from her own sleeve to bind it, murmuring reassurance, even as the head steward shouted about mess and delay. That was when a noblewoman passing through laughed softly, and remarked that maids who played heroes often forgot their place. And Alara, without looking up, answered simply. Someone had to help her, a statement so quiet and sincere it struck harder than defiance. The room went still. The noblewoman's smile thinned, her eyes hardening, because kindness that ignored hierarchy was not innocence, it was rebellion. By evening, the trap was set. Alara was summoned to the West Gallery under the pretense of special cleaning orders, a request that made her chest tighten, because servants were rarely called there without reason. And as she entered the long torchlit corridor, she felt the weight of eyes watching from behind carved pillars and silk-draped doors. A spilled cask waited near the center of the gallery, dark liquid soaking into the rugs, and before she could question it, a voice accused her of negligence, of sabotage, of attempting to disgrace the house again. Nobles gathered quickly, too quickly, their expressions sharpened with anticipation, ready to see her broken publicly this time, ready to remind her that protection from a king did not make her untouchable. Elara's hands trembled as accusations piled up. But she did not cry, did not beg, only stated the truth that she had just arrived, that she would clean the mess regardless. And when a guard shoved her roughly, she stumbled but stayed upright, her silence louder than protest. That was when Kalen arrived. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He only looked at the scene, at the fear carefully arranged to look like justice, at Elara standing alone amid power that despised her refusal to kneel, and something in him hardened into resolve. "Enough," he said, and the word ended the spectacle instantly. He dismissed the nobles with a glance, reassigned the guard without explanation, and ordered Elara escorted out not as punishment, but as protection. As she walked away, shaken and confused, Kalen realized the truth he had tried to avoid. Her kindness was not harmless. It challenged the foundation of his rule, exposed the rot his crown had allowed to flourish, and for the first time in centuries, the vampire king understood that saving one maid might cost him everything he ruled. That night, Kalen understood the danger was no longer the court. It was how much he was willing to lose for her. The council did not argue with kings, but they replaced them quietly. And tonight, they decided the maid was worth more than a throne. The summons came after sunset, carried through the palace like a sickness, whispered from chamber to chamber until even the walls seemed to listen. And Elara felt it before she was told, a pressure in her chest that made it hard to breathe, because servants were never called before the High Council unless something had gone terribly wrong. Kalen stood at the head of the obsidian table when they entered, his expression unreadable, crimson eyes calm but distant, while the elders of the vampire houses sat in a half-circle, their ancient power coiled tight beneath silk and jewels, watching Elara as one might watch a fragile object placed too close to fire. She stood where she was instructed, hands folded, spine straight, reminding herself not to tremble, because fear only fed those who wished to see her broken. The eldest counselor spoke first, her voice smooth and merciless, declaring that the maid's presence had disrupted balance. That favoritism toward a human weakened authority, that whispers of softness invited rebellion across the territories. And Elara understood then that this was not about her actions, but what she represented, a crack in a system built on fear and blood. Kalen listened without interruption as they laid out their verdict with practiced precision. The maid would be dismissed permanently, exiled beyond the borders by dawn, and if the king refused, the council would invoke the right of severance, stripping him of his crown in favor of a successor more suited to rule without distraction. The room held its breath. Elara felt the words like ice against her skin, not because she feared exile, but because she saw what this choice would cost him, and it terrified her more than losing the palace ever could. She stepped forward before she could stop herself, voice quiet but clear, saying she would leave willingly, that no punishment was necessary, that she had never asked for protection, and the council smiled thinly, because submission was what they understood. Kalen turned to her sharply, anger flickering beneath his composure, not at her words, but at the idea that she believed herself expendable. Before he could speak, the torches along the wall flickered violently, shadows stretching unnaturally across the stone, and the air split with a sound like glass cracking, because danger did not always wait for permission. The assassin moved fast, too fast for human eyes, a blur of steel and intent aimed directly at Elara's back, and the council's shock turned to horror as Kellen's body reacted without thought, crossing the space between them in an instant, taking the blade through his shoulder before it could reach her. The room erupted in chaos, guards drawing weapons, elders shouting commands, blood dark against the king's black coat, and Elara screamed his name as she was pulled away, her hands slick with crimson, as she tried to press against the wound he barely acknowledged. Kaelin stood despite the injury, eyes blazing now, power no longer contained. And with a single gesture, the assassin was frozen mid-motion, bones shattering under unseen force, a warning written in silence rather than death. "Anyone who touches her," he said coldly, voice echoing through the chamber, "declares war on me." The council recoiled, realization dawning too late that the choice had already been made, that this was no longer about politics or appearances, but loyalty drawn in blood. Alara looked at him through tears, understanding finally that his protection was not obligation, not curiosity, but something far more dangerous and far more rare. As guards escorted her from the chamber for her safety, Kaelin met her gaze once, a promise and an apology in his eyes. And she knew the truth even before the council spoke again and hushed. Fearful tones dot by saving her. The vampire king had crossed a line no ruler ever returned from. The crown had demanded blood, and Kaelin had answered by offering his own. Asterisk. The council believed the attack had failed. They did not yet understand it had succeeded in revealing the truth. Alara did not sleep that night. She sat beside Kellen's bed in the east wing, hands folded so tightly her fingers ached, watching the slow, unnatural way his wound healed. Vampire blood knitting flesh with a faint red glow that pulsed like a second heart. He should have been resting, surrounded by guards and healers. But instead he had ordered the room cleared, leaving only her and the heavy silence between them, because whatever had been awakened could not be spoken before witnesses. When he finally opened his eyes, sharp and lucid despite the injury, the first thing he did was look at her, not the ceiling, not the wound. And Alara felt a strange ache in her chest, the realization settling that no one had ever chosen her first before. "You should have let me leave," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm inside her, and Kellen's jaw tightened as he pushed himself upright, ignoring the protest of his body. "And let them kill you later?" He replied, not harshly, but with a certainty that unsettled her, because it was not spoken like a king defending property, but like a man defending a life he had decided mattered. Alara shook her head, trying to understand the madness of it all, telling him she was not worth a war, not worth a throne, not worth centuries of rule collapsing into chaos. And when she said the words, the room seemed to shudder, the faint red glow along the walls flaring brighter in response. Kaelin froze. Slowly, carefully, he reached for her wrist, turning her hand palm up, and Alara sucked in a sharp breath as the thin scar there, something she had carried since childhood, began to glow faintly, matching the sigils carved deep into the palace stone. "You didn't know," he murmured, more to himself than to her, and when she asked what he meant, his expression darkened with a mixture of awe and dread. He told her the palace was bound to an ancient covenant older than vampire rule, a magic that responded not to blood alone, but to balance, to those who carried the mark of human lineage intertwined with the land itself, caretakers born, not crowned. Her bloodline, long erased from records, had once been protectors of the realm, chosen not for power, but for compassion. And when the vampires took control, that lineage was hunted, buried, and forgotten, except the magic never forgot. Alara listened in disbelief as the truth unfolded. Memories resurfacing of stories her mother used to whisper, of strange symbols she was warned never to show, of the scar she had hidden out of shame, never knowing it marked her as something rare. "If the council learns this," she whispered, fear creeping into her voice, "they'll use it," and Kaelin nodded grimly, because that was exactly why the assassin had been sent, not to kill her, but to test whether the magic would respond, whether the rumors were true. By protecting her, by bleeding for her, he had confirmed it. The choice before him became brutally clear. If he revealed her nature, the council would force a binding, marrying her to the crown as a living key, draining her will until the kingdom was secure but her spirit gone. If he hid her, rebellion would tear the realm apart, and countless innocents would suffer. Alara felt the weight of it crush down on her, understanding finally that her kindness, her refusal to harden, was not weakness, but the very thing the realm had been missing. And it terrified her that such a thing could be weaponized. Kaelin knelt before her then, ignoring the pain in his shoulder, lowering himself to her level in a gesture that stole her breath. "I will not use you," he said quietly, fiercely, not as a symbol, not as a sacrifice, not as a crown solution. And when she asked what that meant, his eyes softened with a resolve that shook the room. "It means I will end this cycle," he said, "even if it costs me everything I am." Outside the chamber, the palace trembled as the council gathered their forces, sensing the shift, preparing to reclaim control, unaware that the vampire king had already made his decision. The kingdom wanted her power, but Kaelin had decided it would never own her soul. Asterisk, the throne room had never been so full, yet it had never felt so empty. By sunrise, the crown would belong to someone else, or it would cease to exist. The council gathered at dawn, armored in tradition and certainty, believing the night's unrest had ended with the king's wound. Unaware that Kaelin had already crossed the final boundary, they could not undo. Alara stood beside him as the massive doors closed, her presence alone igniting murmurs of outrage and fear, because the magic woven into the palace had awakened fully now. Faint crimson light threading through the floor, answering not to authority, but to truth. The eldest counselor announced the verdict without ceremony. The binding would take place immediately. The maid declared a living anchor to the throne, her consent unnecessary. The king's role reduced to overseer of a ritual centuries old. The words struck Alara like chains snapping shut. Yet before fear could take root, Kaelin stepped forward, calm in a way that terrified them. "There will be no binding," he said, his voice steady, not raised, and the chamber erupted, elders shouting warnings of collapse, of war, of chaos, reminding him of oaths sworn in blood and eternity. Kaelin listened, then reached up and removed the sigil of rule from his collar, the mark that tied his life force to the crown, and the room went deathly silent as he let it fall to the stone floor. "I renounce the throne," he continued, eyes never leaving Alara, "and with it, the right of this council to decide who must suffer so others may feel secure." The palace shuddered as if in grief, magic recoiling violently, because a king had never done this, not in history, not in legend. The council cried betrayal, declared him an exile, a traitor to his kind. But the words rang hollow as the magic responded, not with destruction, but release, the sigils dimming, the binding dissolving like breath in sunlight. Alara felt the pressure lift from her chest, the sense of being claimed fading, replaced by something gentler, something earned rather than taken. Guards hesitated, torn between command and instinct. And when Kaelin took Alara's hand and turned toward the exit, no one moved to stop them, because the power he carried no longer came from a throne, it came from choice. They walked through the palace together, past nobles who looked away in shame, past servants who watched with wide eyes, witnessing something no one would forget, a king leaving his crown behind for a maid who refused to be owned. Outside, the sky broke into pale gold, the first true sunrise Alara had seen since entering the palace, and Kaelin inhaled deeply, as if tasting freedom for the first time in centuries. He told her there would be consequences, that the realm would struggle, that enemies would rise, and she answered simply that cruelty should never be the price of peace. Her words grounding him more than any oath ever had. They left the capital quietly, not as fugitives, But as people choosing a different kind of rule, one built slowly through compassion rather than fear. In the weeks that followed, stories spread faster than armies ever could. Tales of a former vampire king who protected villages instead of taxing them. Of a human woman who healed divisions not with magic, but with presence, reminding both vampire and mortal alike that dignity was not granted by birth. The council fractured, weakened by their own rigidity, and the realm began to change, not through conquest, but through example. Elara never asked for a crown, and Kaelin never tried to give her one. What they built together was quieter, harder, and infinitely more lasting a life where no one knelt, where power served rather than ruled. And when people whispered the old title, she corrected them gently, because she had not been chosen over a crown. She had been chosen over fear. He gave up eternity's throne for a single human life, and in doing so, became the greatest king the realm had ever known.